Most people like to believe they know themselves, but Carl Jung revealed a shocking truth. There's a hidden side to every person, buried deep in the unconscious mind. He called this the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds repressed desires, emotions, and traits that society or the individual themselves deem unacceptable. Traits like jealousy, anger, selfishness, and even primal instincts don't just disappear when ignored. Instead, they sink into the unconscious, shaping behaviors in ways most people fail to recognize. The irony? The more someone tries to suppress their shadow, the more it controls them. From childhood, people are conditioned to reject parts of themselves that don't fit within societal norms or family expectations. A child told that expressing anger is bad learns to suppress it, but that anger doesn't vanish. Instead, it gets stored in the shadow, only to emerge later in destructive ways, like passive-aggressive behavior, outbursts, or even self-sabotage. The same happens with creativity and vulnerability. If someone is shamed for expressing themselves, they unconsciously bury those traits, later struggling with lack of purpose or emotional disconnection. Understanding the shadow isn't about labeling parts of yourself as good or bad. It's about recognizing what has been suppressed and why. People who deny their negative traits end up projecting them onto others, judging qualities in others that they refuse to see in themselves. The key to true self-awareness and personal growth is learning to recognize the repressed emotions and instincts lurking beneath the surface. But if this hidden part of the self isn't just personal, what happens when an entire society suppresses its shadow? If an individual can have a personal shadow, then what happens when an entire society suppresses its darkest impulses? Carl Jung warned that just as individuals repress their negative traits, desires, and emotions, groups, cultures, and even nations develop a collective shadow, a dark, unconscious force that emerges when an entire society refuses to acknowledge its hidden fears, prejudices, and destructive tendencies. The more these aspects are ignored, the more they build up in the unconscious, eventually exploding into violence, oppression, and historical catastrophes. History has provided countless examples of the collective shadow in action. Take Nazi Germany, a nation consumed by deep-seated resentment, fear, and a desire for power. Instead of confronting these unconscious drives, they projected them outward, blaming minorities and perceived enemies for their struggles. This is the terrifying truth of the collective shadow. When repressed emotions aren't confronted, they manifest in mob mentality, war, and mass destruction. The same applies to systemic oppression, where societies bury their guilt and responsibility, only for those shadows to reappear in cycles of violence and division. But the collective shadow isn't just about history. It affects modern society just as much. People see it in political conflicts, social media outrage, and even workplace dynamics. Anytime a group demonizes an opposing side, projecting all negativity onto them while refusing to acknowledge their own flaws, they are engaging in shadow projection. Recognizing this isn't about blame, it's about understanding that unconscious forces drive human behavior on both an individual and societal level. And just as a person must confront their personal shadow, society as a whole must face its collective shadow, or risk being consumed by it. But how does this shadow show up in everyday life, in ways people often don't even realize? The shadow doesn't just stay hidden. It seeps into daily life, influencing decisions, emotions, and relationships in ways most people don't even notice. Carl Jung warned that repressed traits don't disappear. They surface in self-sabotage, addiction, chronic negativity, and even physical ailments. Have you ever felt irrational anger towards someone, despite having no real reason? Or found yourself drawn to people who embody qualities you secretly dislike? That's the shadow at work, manipulating behavior from the unconscious mind. One of the most common ways the shadow reveals itself is through projection. Instead of recognizing their own flaws, fears, or repressed desires, people project them onto others. Someone who suppresses their arrogance, might constantly complain about how others are egotistical. Someone who represses their anger might feel deeply uncomfortable around those who express their emotions freely. This isn't coincidence. It's the shadow mirroring itself in the external world. Relationships, whether romantic, professional, or social, often trigger shadow traits, forcing people to confront aspects of themselves they'd rather avoid. But ignoring these patterns only makes them stronger. Those who refuse to acknowledge their repressed emotions often end up trapped in toxic relationships, repeating the same psychological conflicts over and over. People who suppress vulnerability attract emotionally unavailable partners. Those who ignore their need for boundaries find themselves surrounded by manipulators. The key to breaking free? Recognizing that these triggers aren't just external problems. They're reflections of the unconscious mind trying to be seen. And if these patterns aren't addressed, the shadow grows stronger, leading to even greater destruction. Ignoring the shadow doesn't make it disappear. It makes it stronger, more volatile, and more destructive. Carl Jung warned that when people refuse to confront their repressed emotions, desires, and fears, those hidden parts of the self find their way to the surface in unexpected and often damaging ways. Think of the person who always acts overly nice, suppressing their frustration, until one day they explode in uncontrollable rage. Or the person who prides themselves on being selfless, yet secretly resents those they help. The shadow doesn't stay buried forever. It always finds a way out. One of the most dangerous consequences of repressing the shadow is falling into victimhood and irrational anger. Those who refuse to acknowledge their inner darkness often externalize it, blaming the world, society, or other people for their suffering. They see themselves as victims of circumstance, failing to recognize how their own unconscious mind is shaping their reality. The more they deny their shadow, the more it controls their emotional reactions, leading to self-sabotage, failed relationships, and constant psychological conflict. And in extreme cases, when the shadow is completely ignored, it erupts into destructive behavior, addiction, and even violence. Jung's greatest warning was this: the shadow doesn't just affect individuals, it can take over entire societies. When a culture refuses to acknowledge its collective fears, prejudices, and suppressed emotions, those unconscious forces create division, hatred, and destruction on a massive scale. This is why self-awareness is not just personal. It's essential for the evolution of humanity. The only way to prevent the shadow from consuming a person or a civilization is through its integration. But how exactly does someone integrate their darkest, most hidden self without being overwhelmed by it? Carl Jung believed that true self-awareness and personal growth could only happen through shadow integration. The process of acknowledging, understanding, and accepting the parts of yourself you've repressed. Instead of rejecting your darkest emotions and instincts, you must bring them into consciousness, seeing them for what they truly are. This isn't about indulging in negativity. It's about recognizing that your fears, aggression, and repressed desires hold valuable insights. The moment you stop running from your shadow, you stop being controlled by it. One of the most powerful tools for shadow work is journaling and dream analysis. Jung believed that dreams act as a bridge to the unconscious, revealing the hidden emotions and unresolved conflicts buried within the mind. If you consistently dream about being chased, losing control, or encountering dark figures, your shadow is trying to communicate with you. Writing down emotional triggers, repeated negative patterns, or intense emotional reactions can also help uncover repressed parts of yourself. Ask yourself, what qualities in others trigger me the most? What patterns do I keep repeating? What emotions do I avoid facing? The answers lead directly to the shadow. Once the shadow is recognized, it transforms from an unconscious saboteur into a source of strength, creativity, and emotional depth. People who integrate their dark side develop greater empathy, self-control, and authenticity. They stop projecting their insecurities onto others. They embrace their full identity, light and dark, becoming psychologically balanced and whole. But most importantly, they stop being prisoners of their unconscious mind and start shaping their own destiny. Because once you face your shadow, you finally become who you were meant to be. Most people avoid doing this work because it's uncomfortable. But if you're serious about personal transformation, ask yourself, what patterns keep repeating in my life? What triggers me? What emotions do I suppress? The answers to these questions will lead you straight to your shadow. And that's where your true power lies. The people who grow the most aren't those who avoid their darkness, but those who face it head-on and learn from it. Now, I want to hear from you. What's one part of yourself you've struggled to accept? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how you're confronting your shadow self. And if you're ready to continue this journey of self-awareness and transformation, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's much more to uncover, and you won't want to miss what's next.